My emotions and thoughts are mostly occupied with worry and guilt about my daughter's marriage and children. I feel the need to often tell her and her husband how to do things better and bring up their kids better. It feels that this destroys my life. I mentioned that kind of thing briefly in A New Earth, I believe, that to be a parent is a function, an important function. For many people, it's not only a function, they identify with the function of being a parent, then it becomes a role that you grow into, that it gets hold of you. And then you remain a parent because that's become part of your ego function. It becomes a role that you cannot get out of. And even when your children are already adults, might be 30 years old, you still are forced to act out the role of parent. And that usually does not have a good effect on the relationship. And it is quite possible that you know better. Or it is possible that you just think that you know better. But in either case, perhaps yes, you have more life experience, you've seen more things, so why aren't they listening to you? Because they want to be free. So to let children go, to let go of your identity of parent after you have fulfilled the function of parent, and you have to start doing that as when your children reach adolescence. Gradually, you have to let go, you have to allow them to make mistakes. Advice, yes. Up to a certain age, you still can impose your will, but not for too long. But then they reach 16, 17, 18. If you're still trying to impose your will when they're 18, 19, things get problematic. So you can still guide diplomatically, gently, but then realize they will go their own way, and they will and must make mistakes. So that can be a significant letting go, which requires a certain amount of consciousness. If you have been identified with the role of being a parent, because that's become part of the ego identity has a certain inertia to it. It does not want to let go of whatever its identity is. Every psychotherapist knows that patients come to him, or clients, whatever they're called, and there's always a point is reached when, in many cases, the patient or client sees the possibility of going beyond certain types of dysfunctional behavior or misery, but they are attached to their unhappiness because it's become part of their sense of self. And that is often a critical point in therapy. And often clients or patients disappear. Well, just as they reach the point that there's a possibility of transcending these limitations, because the ego feels, I'm going to lose myself. So what you need here is presence, and especially self-observation, rather than focusing all your attention on what your children are doing with their children and so on, and what they can do better. Put at least as much or more attention into the workings of your mind and see how it is associated with not being able to let go of the role of parent. So, and here you say, your emotions and thoughts are mostly occupied with worry and guilt about my daughter's marriage and children. So even when you're not seeing them, you're thinking about it. Now, this is just another example of uncontrolled use of mind, which is not a use of mind, you are being used by the egoic mind. Is there enough awareness in you? You have to ask yourself and verify it in your own experience. Is there enough awareness in you when this happens again? You start thinking about her, worrying about her, they're making mistakes. At that moment, are you able to know that this is what your mind is doing? And perhaps in the past that wasn't possible. Perhaps after this retreat, your awareness has grown, so the awareness can be there when the mind does its usual thing. And then you recognize that actually it serves no useful purpose to worry about this, except to keep this identity alive in you. You're not helping them by worrying, and you're probably not helping them by giving them advice that they don't want. So, to recognize the futility of what the mind is doing, this is so futile, isn't it? That's still a thought, but it comes from the awareness. That's a true thought. The rest are unconscious thoughts. You can have true thoughts that arise out of awareness, and often those true thoughts have something to say about the unconscious thoughts. Say, this is so crazy. Do I want to do this for the rest of my life? I'd rather not think these thoughts anymore, and therefore I will put my attention on the fact that I'm breathing. And I'll put my attention on looking at the sky and be in the present moment. And then a few minutes later you will find the thoughts trying to creep in again, and they want your attention. One little thought comes, come this way. And you watch that. Okay, I'm not going there again. Sorry, I've had it for years. It's had served no purpose, just made me unhappy, made my relationship with my daughter unpleasant. I don't want it anymore. Thanks, you've been very kind, thank you. And then you choose to put your attention on something else, your inner body, the aliveness, and preferably present moment, and preferably not annihilate yourself by having a few drinks. I mean, those kind of drinks that annihilate you, that doesn't work. You don't need that. Another way of annihilating your own thoughts is by turning on the TV. Now you may notice, interesting thing, when you turn on the TV, you're not thinking anymore. So one could think that occasional thoughts may come in, but you could actually sit there in a trance-like state for a whole hour, watching whatever is there, and even changing channels, and you would still be in a trance-like state. And you can't even get out. You know there's nothing, because there's always the next channel might have something interesting. And even if every channel is totally uninteresting, there's always, what about the next one? And you're in a trance-like state in which actually you might think, oh, isn't that good? I'm not thinking anymore. But you have fallen below thought. And if you're actually watching a program, a sitcom or whatever it is, then you are linking into the thoughts on the screen, that people are talking, there's drama on the screen, you're linking into, so you're not free of thought, you're free of personalized thought, but you exchange personalized thought for that kind of thought. So that's not the way to go to become free of dysfunctional thinking, because that's just another way of falling below thinking. So you need to rise above thinking. It could be other things that plague you on a daily basis, certain types of thoughts that recur, that if you look at them clearly, fulfill no purpose except to make you unhappy and to strengthen your fictitious sense of identity. So your psychological function, you're not a mother anymore. It's not your identity, but biologically, yes, you are the mother for this daughter. But your identity is not being a mother anymore. You have to transcend that limited identity. So thinking happens to them, and then the next evolutionary step for humanity is the transcendence of thinking. It's an incredible shift in consciousness that will, of course, manifest when a sufficient number of humans have gone through this incredible shift in consciousness. The world that they create, of course, will look very different from the world that is created by humans who are completely identified with thinking. In other words, the world that is created by the egoic mind in its personal and collective aspect. Needless to say, the collective aspect of the egoic mind is even more insane than the personal aspect of the collective mind. So that's the world we create. I can't help it. Sometimes good intentions arise, and that's fine in humans who are still obsessed with their thought, possessed by their thought, egoically dominated. But they can see, well, we want to do something good. But they haven't overlooked the basic dysfunction in the human psyche, which is involuntary and compulsive and conditioned thinking. There's been no transcendence of thought. And then if you say, I want to change the world, you can see what's wrong with the world, but you cannot see the deep causes of why these things that are wrong with the world. You see the surface manifestations of what's wrong with the world and want to change things on the surface manifestations. For example, in early 20th century and late 19th century, there was the arising of people became very much aware of the terrible injustices, and of course there was the arrival of industrial revolution started in England, and there was terrible, the lower working classes were in a terrible condition, and so you can see, yes, there's something wrong here. And so certain theories arose that looked very good on the surface. We need to have a fairer society. These people are being exploited, and those are the ones who exploit. Communism, the ideas started growing. It sounds wonderful on the surface. We're going to change the world. But there's a very wise proverb, of course, that you're all familiar with, about the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And then finally, when the theory was put into practice, Russia, China, it didn't turn out so well. The intentions were good initially, I suppose, to a large extent, perhaps not 100% good, but they were good. And yet they created hell for millions. They created also, again, huge inequality between the people on top and all the others. And millions of people died because in order to bring about a better world, according to your theory, you had to kill a few million first. So if you overlook that there's a fundamental dysfunction in the human psyche, whatever plan you have to implement changes, honestly, I'm not saying don't do anything until you're totally enlightened. No, you're already relatively conscious, so you can participate, take conscious action, that's fine. Always knowing that the fundamental change is in human consciousness, and you need to embody that change while you take action. The transcendence of thinking means the transcendence of the egoic mind. It means that you are able to spend part of your time relatively free of compulsive thinking, certainly free of self-serving thinking and destructive thinking that continuously creates unhappiness for yourself and the people around you. How many people live the compulsive narrative in your mind that for many people is very negative, constantly critical, constantly complaining, never at ease with what is. There's always something wrong, fault finding, because the ego grows through the constant opposition, constant antagonism, never at ease, always looking for the next thing to complain about. And it strengthens the egoic self. The more you complain, offended is a new version these days. It's very popular on the internet. I'm very, very offended. Outrageous. How dare you? There are thousands or hundreds of thousands who go on every day, they look on their screen waiting for the next thing to be offended by. And the ego loves it. And for many of them, it's the only way they can inflate their ego, by sitting on the screen and sending out tweets. The transcendence of thinking is not any kind of regressive movement. We are not regressing to the state of somebody whose mind is relatively undeveloped and who does not have a problem with egoic thinking because there's very little going on in their minds. What used to be called, before it became politically incorrect, idiot or fool. The fool was, they were always, you could see happy fools. They don't, there's not enough thinking to make them unhappy, so they are below egoic thinking. In medieval times, every village had at least one village idiot or fool, and normal was accepted, essential part of the community. And even the royal courts had a fool, a very important figure, although that figure probably was just pretending to be a fool. And that was one of the most, sometimes very influential position in the royal court, but also one of the most dangerous jobs you could have, because you could lose your head at any moment. But only the fool was able to tell the king or queen what was wrong, by making it into a funny story. But the fool is more deeply connected, as we know from mythology, the fool is more deeply connected with the source still, hasn't gone as far out as a normally developed human. He's more simple. The fool, for example, relatively speaking, is a simpleton. It's like the Hobbit in Lord of the Rings. The Hobbit is a simple guy, doesn't think in complex terms, loves the simple things of life, loves eating and enjoyment. But why the fool has to go on this important mission that nobody else can carry out? That's a mythological motive. That's often the case, because the fool has a connectedness still with source that the more developed humans don't have. Similar motive in Forrest Gump, the movie. The fool does great things, this guy, Forrest Gump, but because and life always supports him. If you watch that movie again, he saves people in the war, he does heroic things, but he doesn't claim credit because he doesn't have much of an ego yet. And always life gives him the next thing and the next thing, supports him. But we don't want to go there. When I say cessation of thinking, I'm not talking about regressing to the stage that is the pre-thinking stage of humanity. I'm thinking about rising above, pointing to the possibility of rising above thinking. So you stop thinking, which is normally associated with diminishment of consciousness, and transcendence of thinking is an intensification of consciousness, turning up the light. This is why the term attention and alertness, those terms are extremely important. They're also used in Zen very frequently. The Zen teachings could be described, if you wanted to summarize Zen, you can just say simple things like pay attention. There was one Zen teacher who would, whenever they asked him a question to explain Zen, he became quite famous. He would always raise his finger. Please explain Zen to us. What is Zen? I haven't quite understood yet. He was calling people to attention. Now, being aware of the weather, the various ways in which the weather manifests in the present moment, is also a way of bringing you into the now, to feel the breeze of the air on your skin, for example. Listen to the sounds of rain or the wind in the trees. And one of my favorites is watching the sky, the continuously changing paintings, abstract paintings that appear in the sky. The air, breathing in the air, the scents, the smells of nature. And taking in the entire energy field that surrounds you. Now, where I'm sitting, there's not much nature in this room. It's a little studio, but that's okay. if you go within, you encounter your own nature, your own essential nature. I believe it was Ralph Waldo Emerson, the American writer, spiritual writer, 19th century, who said something like, "The wick of individual life runs deep into the oil of pure being." That's an interesting analogy and quite a powerful one. The wick, if English is not your native language and you happen not to know what wick is the string that is in the candle that you light that draws up the wax, or it's the string in an oil lamp, and you light the wick that sticks out of the oil, and you light it, then there's a flame. The wick draws up the oil. That oil is then consumed by the flame. So that's the wick. And in this analogy, he said, the wick of individual life, your individual life, runs deep into the oil of pure being. So that means there is a great depth within you, and your individual consciousness derives its sustenance from the greater universal consciousness, is only a manifestation or an emanation of the greater one consciousness that you also are, that you are more fundamentally than the individual. The wick that's burning on the surface. You are a surface phenomenon on the level of your physical body and the sense perceived, all the sense perceived aspects of yourself, and even your thinking, although your thinking is already exists in the realm of invisibility. Nobody has ever seen a thought. You cannot see a thought. You cannot perceive it with your senses. And yet even thinking is a relatively superficial or surface phenomenon. It belongs to the dimension of your individual form. But there could be no thinking and there could be no sense perception if you were not connected to something deeper, which is consciousness. So you are an emanation of something very profound, very deep, that connects you with the totality of the universe. Now, the important thing is to realize the truth of this directly, which means to sense that depth in you. here and now, so that in addition to knowing yourself as an individual person, in the analogy that Emerson used, that's the wick, in addition to knowing yourself as an individual person, surrounded by many other individual persons and life forms, in addition to that, you are aware of a deeper dimension within yourself. And when I say you are aware of it, may not be totally correct, because the awareness, when you become aware of your own awareness, when you become aware of the fact that you are conscious right now, and you can only become aware of that if for a moment there's no thinking, and yet you have not fallen asleep. For a moment there's a cessation of thinking, like now. What do you need to think about now? Nothing. For a moment there's no thinking. In that moment there's a stillness, an alert stillness. That is the awareness of who you are beyond your individual form. That is the beginning of the pure being that Emerson speaks of. It's not that difficult, especially here, right here and now, where you're not being disturbed, hopefully, by all the demands that the world normally places upon you. It's not that difficult here and now to have these brief moments, and perhaps even longer moments, when you are aware of an inner alert stillness. Cessation of thinking. What remains is consciousness. Prior to thought. Consciousness before it becomes a thought. And that I sometimes describe as the deep I, as opposed to the surface. I'm not talking about this I, because that's also an interesting analogy, but I'm talking about the first person singular I, pronoun. Pronoun. The deep I is that being, the I am, awareness of the I amness, beingness. The surface I that you normally identify with, and that normally when you use the word I in everyday usage, you refer to the surface I, your personality, your past, the person that you are, the bundle of thoughts and emotions that make up the personality. That's the surface I. And in the absence of thought activity, the surface I subsides. And if you have not fallen below thought and towards sleep, but have risen above thought, then there is an alert stillness, not a tired stillness. That is the essence of who you are, as that is the unconditioned consciousness. And it's so close, it's not that difficult to experience, to realize this alive depth in you, where the personality is transcended. Although you still have or you still are for a while, of course, also the surface self is still there. And most likely you will again and again become completely identified with the surface self, which is a normal human consciousness, the normal unawakened consciousness, the normal fairly dysfunctional consciousness. And dysfunctional because it doesn't know its own depth. It doesn't know the root. You're, in other words, dysfunctional because you're out of touch with yourself. Yourself meaning the deep I, the unconditioned consciousness. If you cannot sense that, in the background, even while you are acting in this world as a person, you can still, this is the aim of awakening means, if you are awakened, first you have glimpses of awakening, but you can sense yourself as this deep I. That's fine. And then the glimpses are a little longer. And then you may find gradually in your everyday life, you can live from that deeper place. That changes the way in which you think. Habitual thoughts are still there, but a deeper intelligence flows into your mind. Your thinking becomes creative, more alive, less dysfunctional, doesn't create suffering anymore for yourself and others, because otherwise your thinking creates an enormous amount of suffering, unhappiness. This is still the case for millions of humans on the planet. So the deepest meaning of Shakespeare's words, "To your own self be true," the deepest meaning of that is to be in touch with that pure being, which is the unconditioned consciousness, which is your true being, your true self. It's no longer a separate self. It connects you to the totality. So this frees you from the prison of your personality. If you're not aware of that deeper dimension to who you are, you're trapped on the surface level of who you are, constantly looking for an enhanced sense of identity on the surface level, where no true and ultimately satisfying sense of identity can ever be found. The conditions in your life, they can fulfill you for a while, and then it's no longer fulfilling. This happens to relationships, it happens to jobs that you find, activities. Unless you go deeper, nothing is fulfilling for very long. You are not a set of problems that you need to resolve. So let's go back to that beautiful, very simple realization that you don't need to remember anything about what your mind tells you who you are. It doesn't mean that you now have lost all your memories. No, they are still there if you need them. They come back. Whatever analogy you want to use, I used to say the filing system, when you need it, you can pull it out, but they don't use it anymore. So it's a computer analogy you use now. It's there somewhere in your computer. It's all still there. When you need it, of course, it's still there. But does it have to be there always when you don't need it? That continuous, the problematic self-talk, does it need to be? Do you need to be burdened and walk around every day of your life burdened by the problem making? Well, it's pretending to be problem solving, but it's really problem making of your mind, and to carry around with you the heavy entity, the me, which goes, And you're trying to get to a point, at some future point, you think I'm going to be liberated and free of all that, and then I will start living. And many people, even if they don't verbalize it as I do right now, the underlying mindset is, when I can free myself from all these problems, then I can start living. And that, of course, when you are 25, you can still believe that. When you're 35, you say, yeah, it can still happen. And when you become 45 and 50, okay, maybe I'll really start living when I retire. And then you begin to live for the retirement. Okay, only another 3 years now. And finally, the day comes, and then on the first day of your retirement, you sit at home and say, what now? Who am I without my function, my social function? But nobody's telling me who I am anymore. What am I going to do now? And then you try golf. And you drive around in the golf buggies. And for a few weeks it feels good and you can drink and so. And then that dissatisfaction returns. The same mindset is still there despite your retirement. In fact, you become more aware of the dissatisfied mind now that you don't have to have that many external problems anymore, and yet there's still the heaviness of the mind and the discontent. So that's not the way to go. So the wonderful news is there is a dimension in you that we could call the dimension of depth, or the transcendent dimension, where you as the person become something else, where the person can only really often compare the person that you are to the ripple on the surface of the ocean. That's the person. But the ripple is one with the totality of the ocean. If the ripple doesn't know that, its existence is problematic, fearful. You fear every other ripple, or you want to incorporate them into your life. Maybe if we come with me, together we'll be a bigger ripple. Marry me. And you will make me happy, and I will make you happy. It has been tried many times. So to lead a satisfying existence as a ripple that only knows itself as the ripple and not as the ocean is very frustrating. You can't. It doesn't work. So the ripple needs to realize that it is much deeper than just the ripple. There's a depth to the ripple where it's no longer a ripple, where it's connected with everything and with every other ripple, where it's connected with the heart of the universe, not just on a human level. And that is true awakening. And after that, and when that is realized and the ripple can sense that, it's a stillness in you, a presence that has no particular content, then the ripple becomes relatively happy. It doesn't mean in the world, on the surface of ripples, things still can go wrong, still things can disappear and break down, and ripples never last for very long. That continues, and yet you feel you can actually enjoy your ripple identity and enjoy the surface of life also. It's actually quite nice. Here, look at all those little ripples. And ripple means whatever you perceive in this analogy. A ripple means whatever life form is there in your perception, including yourself, and whatever, whether it's humans or whatever you perceive in this existence, it is the manifestation of life, of the one life that has manifested as a multiplicity of life forms. And each life form is inhabited by the one life, a manifestation of the one life or the one consciousness. So when you realize that, and that's the beginning of that realization is to sense the I that has nothing to do with your past or your future or your name or anything your mind is saying. Your simple presence. That means the ripple is becoming aware of something much bigger. And suddenly we have a relatively happy ripple. And it can enjoy every moment of its ripple existence in a sense of wonder, because it's no longer demanding that things that are not permanent should be permanent. And it's not demanding anymore that the surface existence of things should satisfy me. You're here to satisfy me. You're here to make me happy. You're here to fulfill me. The surface of the ripple can't do that. The conditions in your life, they can fulfill you for a while, and then it's no longer fulfilling. This happens to relationships, it happens to jobs that you find, activities. Unless you go deeper, nothing is fulfilling for very long. And so, this is why we are here, and this is the meaning of retreat. It's a retreat from yourself in order to find what the Buddhists would call the no-self, or what other teachings would call the deeper self, or the Atman, or your Buddha nature, or the Christ within, whatever term you want to use to point to it. And that's why we're here. So all the external things here are helpful. It's easier here to connect with the depths of who you are and realize the depths of who you are. Of course, when you leave here, then you get challenged again. It's not that you don't get challenged here too, and especially if you're still very much identified with the mind, you find many challenges wherever you go. This isn't right. Don't like that. He doesn't look very spiritual to me. Or the opposite, all these people are so much more spiritual than me. Do they know that I'm not spiritual? So the practice is to voluntarily, as much as possible, relinquish identification with the thinking mind and your usual self. And what very much helps with that is just as much as you can. Don't walk around as a heavy personality and person. No, walk around as a light, as a field of conscious perception, and like a little child that goes and look at everything. In other words, presence practice. Here, it's more easier than in your usual surroundings. Presence practice, present moment practice, No, you will never solve your problems. If you solve 2 problems, 3 more will creep up behind you. That's how life is. It's not meant to be free of challenges. It's meant to awaken you. And this is the possibility of awakening, is to realize this beingness. Now, beingness comes from the verb to be the most fundamental thing, to be. Now, what's the first person singular of to be? It is not I be. Strangely, you say I am. I am. Now, all you know when you're not thinking is that you are. That's beyond doubt. You can sense the presence that you are. And that is the realization of yourself, not as a person or as a form identity, but the realization of yourself as consciousness. In essence, who or what you are is consciousness, and it's not yours. You're a manifestation of universal, because only one consciousness that manifests in countless forms briefly. And if you can go there and be rooted in that and realize that is who you are beyond form. The analogy that works quite well that I usually use for this is, if you imagine yourself to be a ripple on the surface of the ocean. Let's say every human being here is a ripple on the surface of the ocean. Now, ripples are short-lived, but so are humans. A little bit longer than a ripple, but from a more universal perspective, a human life is a brief thing. It's a flicker, goes birth, old age, and death. So everywhere on the planet there are these flickers of consciousness, but it's the same consciousness continuously manifesting form. I am is the word. All you can say is I am, but you don't add anything, not this or that. I am. In the Old Testament, God is asked, who are you? And that's perhaps the most profound sentence in the Old Testament, is I am that I am, where God defines him, her, itself as the I am, as the essence identity of all forms. And also another beautiful sentence in the Old Testament, as you know, the Old Testament is the New Testament, the Bible is a mixed bag of fantastic things and other things. But I like to look for the jewels that are there. Another beautiful statement that points to all this is, be still and know that I am God. Be still and know that I am God. Now these words are all synonymous. Be refers to being. Still is the state of consciousness without thought, stillness. Being and stillness, the same thing. And know, there is a deep knowing in that. In fact, that is because that is the source of all intelligence. There's a deep knowing, but from the point of view of the conceptual mind, it looks like unknowing. It looks like ignorance, because it's not knowing through concepts anymore. There's a deeper knowing, and this is where what we call wisdom arises, which is very different from intelligence, the IQ kind of intelligence. The wisdom that the world needs, not more intelligence, please, no, but wisdom that, yes, be still and know that I am. It is the I am of the I am of being God. Oh, here we come to a difficult word, but they're all synonymous. What is God then? I rarely talk about God because you can't really, it's so transcendent that whatever you say would be very limited. As you know, human language and human thought is relatively limited. How can I make statements about the ultimate transcendent reality just by producing a few weird sounds with my vocal cords, plus air pressure through my tongue and lips, or the vowels A, I, A, E, I, O, U, E, U, R. This is what language is. Oh, okay, now tell me the ultimate secrets of God in the transcendent universe. You can't. It's absurd. Just produce a few sounds and that explains. No. However, I'll carry on talking. All we can do is give an analogy or like a poetic image of what God might be and how God relates to who you are. And that image is that I prefer is the image of our, we can only use images from our sense-perceived universe. The sun is a life-giving thing in our universe. The sun gives of itself ceaselessly for millions and millions of years. One could almost say eternally. It's not eternal, but as far as we are concerned, it's eternal. Without the sun, there would be no life, no physical life here. So the sun gives of itself, it emanates continuously. The very heat in your body ultimately comes from the sun. So the sun, if you use the sun as an analogy for the transcendent God, God has no location in space or time. God is neither there, or if we have to say anything, we could say God is right here, because it's transcendent to this dimension. So if we use this as an analogy, the transcendent emanates into this dimension something that creates form, that creates life. And what it ultimately, this thing that it emanates is consciousness. At first, very little. At first, consciousness appears as if we're frozen as minerals and stones. And then consciousness becomes as if it were liquid, if we use the analogy of water, and then it becomes vegetative life. And consciousness gradually evolves. So one consciousness, more of it comes in. Then you get animal life. It's like, and then you get human life. It becomes ethereal. It's a human mind. So emanating from the source of all life that is transcendent, of which you cannot say anything, into this world, as the sun emanates light, the God emanates consciousness, and this brings about this universe. And in this universe, it's a process. It grows. In the transcendent, we don't know anything about that. So, but the important thing is the ray of sunlight that hits your hand, you feel the warmth on your hand, that ray, it's not the sun. You couldn't say, I have the sun on my hand. I mean, if you got close to the sun, you would immediately disappear. But this ray of sunlight is still connected to the sun in some way. It is still part of the sun. We can't even say where the sun exactly ends. It doesn't really end anywhere. It doesn't have a clearly defined surface. It extends outward, so it emanates continuously. So what the source of all life emanates is consciousness. And you can sense that in yourself. When you can sense yourself as consciousness, the presence, then you realize this. The ripple on the surface of the ocean has realized that it is not only a ripple. I'm mixing analogies now. It's not only a ripple. More fundamentally, the ripple is the ocean. And suddenly the ripple is no longer fearful, because it can sense its deep connectedness to that which is vast and all-encompassing. If other people did something bad, then what is called guilt, then that becomes, you have a resentment or grievance towards somebody else. And again, it is quite possible that, more likely that whatever happened at that time, almost certainly it was perpetrated by a human being who was, maybe he, she still is now, if they're still alive, who was unconscious, forced by the egoic, the dysfunction of the egoic self to perpetrate that. And again, the danger is if we equate the unconscious action of another, if we make an identity for the other out of that, that is also a trap for the ego again. So whether you do it to yourself, then in which case it is guilt, a guilt-ridden sense of self, or somebody else did something to you, and then you are burdened with a sense of deep resentment or grievance, or a sense of having been a victim of somebody, and then you adopt a victim identity, which again is a very strong egoic identity. So you see yourself as a victim, you think of yourself as a victim of this or that event or those actions. But those are all egoic identities. So you can recognize what somebody did in the past, and you may not. Forgiveness is something we need to be very careful with, because it's often used in a superficial sense. People say you need to forgive yourself for something you did, and they say you need to forgive somebody else for what they did. And then sometimes people say, I forgive you, but how deep does it go? Perhaps they have an image of themselves as quite spiritual, and then that what they say corresponds. They want to simply to reinforce the image they have of themselves as a spiritual person who does not harbor resentment. I'm too spiritual for resentment. I forgive you. You're fine. Yeah. But deep down, they're still. There are many negative emotions when you have a strong self-image of a particular kind, for example, spiritual or religious. You have that, this is who I am, and then it can easily happen that you deny certain things that contradict your belief in who you are. They're the exact opposite of your belief of being a spiritual or religious person. So if there are many cases that happen over many centuries to many religious people, impossible to recognize the negative emotions within themselves because they would have conflicted with their self-image. And if you then repress them, they get even worse. And then they come out in bursts of extreme anger or even violence. And then the mind, even that is justified then by the egoic mind. So the unconscious parent who beats their child in a rage, but who thinks of themselves as spiritual, say, I'm doing it for your own good. So they reinterpret what they are doing, which is bad. They reinterpret it so that it fits in with their self-image as a good person. So you lie to yourself continuously. Crazy. So all these things happen because there's lack of awareness, and you're looking for an identity, and you're grasping wherever you can find your identity in the past. You're grasping at some things, certain memories, images. So you haven't found your deeper identity, which is the indwelling consciousness itself. And then you need some substitute identity. So these are all cases where people have substitute identities. They have conceptual identities of who they are. And basically you live in a kind of, in your own matrix. Conditioned egoic mind. And you cannot see reality, you can't see what you are doing. Jesus said the famous words on the cross, forgive them for they know not what they do. What he means, of course, maybe if it had been in recent times, he would have expressed it slightly differently. He would have said, forgive them for they are totally unconscious. Now the real forgiving happens when you recognize that there is a dimension in you that has not been affected by whatever happened to you, whatever anybody did to you. There's a dimension in you, which is why we're here, to access that more deeply. And again, whether we call that the stillness, the consciousness itself, the unconditioned consciousness, or if you're religious, Christ consciousness, the Christ within, the inner Christ, the inner Buddha nature, whatever you want to call it. There is something that actually cannot be touched by anything that happens to you as a person. As a person, you can suffer a lot in this world. And some people suffer more than others, but everybody suffers. As a person, you suffer. As a human, you suffer. The being beyond the human, because as you know, you're a human being, the being beyond the human is actually not touched by suffering. So you have to find that timeless essence that is within you, that is the inner aspect of what we call the world soul, which also the world soul also is beyond suffering. And the world soul continuously creates and recreates, although things die all the time. The world soul, there have already been I can't remember, 4 or 5 mass extinctions on the planet over millions and millions of years, when each time life on the planet became 80% destroyed, 70%, even 90% on one mass extinction on the planet. Almost all life forms wiped out. And you would say this is definitely the end. But it wasn't the end. The planet regenerated. After several mass extinctions, it regenerated again. It just took a while, not too long, just a few million years. It regenerated, and then the life that then arose was of an even greater complexity of life forms. There was something that could not be destroyed. Even when the meteorites hit, they say the last extinction perhaps was when the dinosaurs became extinct. A huge meteorite hit the planet and led to an extinction of life, most of life on the planet. But there was something beyond it. There was this planetary intelligence. Anima mundi is the soul of the world. But one aspect of the larger soul of the world is the soul of the planet. The soul of the planet is an aspect of the world soul. And your soul is an aspect also of the world soul. They're not separate. So the planet is a life form that has its own intelligence, which is an aspect of the one intelligence. And that is not, out of that, the recreation happens again and again, and each time chaos erupts and destroys it, a higher order develops out of the chaos, which is not to say that we should welcome the next extinction that we perhaps create. And so it is our task to learn to recognize again the sacredness of life on the planet, that is vital part of the awakening of human consciousness.